Before the world fractures, it flatters itself with order. The operating room is clean, controlled, bathed in light that promises mastery over chaos. Precision rules. Hands move with authority earned through repetition and applause. In this space, error is an enemy to be conquered, not a teacher to be heard. The culture surrounding this room believes in excellence as a moral virtue, skill as identity, and certainty as proof of worth. Nothing here questions the central figure who commands the space, because nothing here has ever needed to. Stephen Strange belongs to this world, not as a participant, but as its axis. He is not merely successful within it, he is structured by it. His name circulates like currency. His presence organizes attention. The room adjusts itself around his expectations. This is not arrogance in the simple sense. It is alignment. A system built to reward control has shaped a man who mistakes control for insight and insight for enlightenment. The conflict does not announce itself yet. It breathes quietly beneath the surface, sustained by applause. The culture that produces Strange is not unique. It is modern, technocratic, obsessed with outcomes, allergic to vulnerability. It elevates individuals who appear invulnerable and punishes those who hesitate. In such an environment, self-reflection is tolerated only when it improves performance. Inner life is acceptable only when it sharpens the blade. Strange excels because he embodies this ethic completely. His confidence is not cosmetic. It is infrastructural. It holds the world together as he understands it. But systems that reward mastery often disguise fragility as strength. The illusion begins here. When everything works, when power flows without resistance, the absence of limits feels like transcendence. Strange does not believe he is superior to others because he is cruel. He believes it because the world has repeatedly confirmed it. Every success narrows his field of vision. Every triumph reinforces the idea that insight is earned through dominance over complexity. Enlightenment, in this frame, is indistinguishable from being right. The accident arrives not as tragedy, but as interruption. Metal folds. Glass shatters. Time compresses into impact. The body that once obeyed every command becomes unreliable, then hostile. Hands that defined identity turn into evidence of loss. This is not punishment. It is exposure. The system that elevated Strange cannot accommodate him anymore. The lights dim. The applause evaporates. What remains is not humility, but disbelief. The world has violated its contract. In the aftermath, Strange does not grieve a life. He resists a verdict. His suffering is not rooted in pain alone, but in negation. Everything that made sense no longer functions. The center collapses. Yet even here, the conflict remains latent. He does not question the framework that failed him. He searches for a replacement that will restore his position within it. Healing becomes conquest. Meaning becomes recovery of status. The quest begins under the banner of necessity, but is driven by something older and sharper. The journey outward mirrors a movement inward that Strange refuses to acknowledge. He crosses borders, languages, beliefs, not as a pilgrim, but as a claimant. Each new territory is evaluated by its usefulness to his restoration. The world expands, but his orientation does not. He is willing to believe in anything that promises return. Faith is tolerated only as instrument. Mystery is acceptable only if it yields control. The deeper currents remain unseen. When he arrives at the threshold of another order, one that does not operate by familiar hierarchies, the tension sharpens. This space does not reward certainty. It does not respond to credentials. It does not kneel to brilliance. Here, power is not granted by dominance, but by alignment. The structures are ancient, layered, resistant to simplification. Strange reads them as puzzles to be solved, not as systems that demand transformation. He studies the surface. He ignores the demand. What follows appears to be awakening. New abilities emerge. Perception widens. Reality bends. Strange learns faster than others. He adapts with frightening speed. The audience is invited to see this as growth. The language surrounding him supports this interpretation. Discipline, insight, transcendence. Yet something fundamental remains unchanged. The axis has shifted, but it still points inward. The throne has moved, but the posture is identical. Spiritual language becomes camouflage. Mastery over time, space, and consequence feels like proof of elevation. The absence of fear masquerades as wisdom. Detachment is mistaken for clarity. Strange does not abandon his ego. He refines it. He replaces one arena with another. The operating room becomes a sanctum. The scalpel becomes a spell. The applause becomes reverence. The structure remains intact. This is where the conflict truly begins, though it still avoids direct confrontation. The question is no longer whether Strange will regain power. He already has. The question is whether power, when unexamined, inevitably reshapes the self around its own preservation. The story has not yet polarized. It has only revealed its center of gravity. What stands before us is not a hero transformed, but a system relocated. The forces that once governed one domain now operate in another. The language has changed. The symbols are different. The promises sound deeper. Yet the same gravity pulls everything inward. The world waits. The fracture has not opened. It has only been prepared. Stephen Strange does not begin as a seeker. He begins as a structure. Long before mysticism enters his field of vision, his psyche is already organized around hierarchy, validation, and exclusion. His intelligence does not merely distinguish him from others, it separates him. Knowledge, in his world, is not shared terrain but elevated ground. To know more is to stand above. To stand above is to be safe. This internal architecture is reinforced daily by an external order that rewards distinction and punishes dependency. Strange learns early that worth is proven through performance and sustained through distance. The profession that shapes him is not incidental. Surgery offers a perfect symbolic environment for a particular kind of psyche. Precision is moralized. Hesitation is framed as weakness. Control is not only necessary but virtuous. The body becomes an object to be corrected, not a subject to be listened to. In this space, empathy is permitted only insofar as it does not interfere with outcome. Strange thrives here because his temperament aligns seamlessly with the logic of the system. He does not need to suppress doubt. The environment has already done that work for him. What emerges is not cruelty but insulation. Strange does not lack feeling, he lacks permeability. Others exist in his awareness as variables, obstacles, or mirrors of his own superiority. His identity is stabilized through contrast. The less competent the world appears, the more coherent he feels. This dynamic produces an ego that is not flamboyant but fortified. It does not seek admiration for pleasure. It requires it for orientation. Without constant confirmation, the internal structure begins to wobble. When the accident removes his hands from the equation, it does more than end a career. It dissolves the symbolic foundation upon which his identity rests. The trauma is not merely physical. It is ontological. The instrument through which he accessed meaning is gone. Strange reacts not with surrender, but with rage disguised as resolve. He refuses the implication that limits are real. He rejects dependency as humiliation. Healing becomes an obsession not because he desires wholeness, but because he cannot tolerate displacement. This refusal sets the stage for his encounter with mysticism. Importantly, Strange does not arrive as a believer, but as a negotiator. He approaches the unknown with the same posture he once brought to the operating table. He observes. He measures. He tests. The unseen is treated as an extension of the visible, simply governed by different rules that have yet to be mastered. Mystery does not destabilize him. It provokes him. He assumes that with sufficient intellect and discipline, any system can be conquered. The world he enters does not immediately contradict this assumption. On the contrary, it appears to reward it. He learns rapidly. He exceeds expectations. He bends reality with alarming ease. Compared to others, he advances faster, reaches further, commands more. From the outside, this looks like destiny. From within, it feels like vindication. The narrative reinforces the idea that he was always meant for this role, that his suffering was preparation, that his superiority has finally found its proper arena. Yet beneath this arc of apparent transcendence, the same psychological mechanisms remain operative. Strange does not dissolve his sense of centrality. He relocates it. The mystical order becomes another territory to be occupied, another hierarchy to be navigated, another stage upon which distinction can be performed. He adopts the language of humility without internalizing its implications. Detachment becomes strategic. Discipline becomes justification. The ego does not retreat. It spiritualizes. This is the critical inversion at the heart of Strange's foundation. Enlightenment, as he understands it, does not involve surrender of control, but its refinement. He learns to let go only where letting go grants greater leverage elsewhere. Power is no longer exerted through hands, but through perception. Time, space, causality become instruments. The self remains untouched. The deeper demand of the mystical world, the erosion of centrality, the dissolution of hierarchy, the acceptance of not knowing, remains unmet. The mentors he encounters sense this tension. They do not confront it directly because the system itself depends on figures like Strange. Guardians require warriors. Orders require enforcers. The very structure that claims transcendence relies on control to maintain itself. This complicity allows Strange to advance without facing the core contradiction. He is celebrated as exceptional while remaining fundamentally unchanged. The system recognizes his utility and accommodates his ego rather than challenging it. Thus, the conflict is not between Strange and an external antagonist. It is between two conceptions of power operating within the same symbolic space. One demands alignment through dissolution. The other seeks dominance through mastery. Strange stands at their intersection, embodying the unresolved tension. His story does not arise from ignorance of spiritual principles, but from selective application of them. He adopts what enhances his position and discards what threatens it. By the time he assumes his role as protector, the foundations are set. The world reads him as enlightened. He reads himself as necessary. The audience is invited to admire his restraint, his intelligence, his sacrifice. Yet the underlying structure remains intact. The ego has not been destroyed. It has been armored in meaning. What follows will not be a battle between good and evil, but between preservation and transformation. The system is in motion now, and neutrality is no longer possible. The first phase of conflict does not announce itself through catastrophe, but through repetition. Strange begins to operate within the mystical order the same way he once operated within medicine. He studies relentlessly. He memorizes structures. He anticipates outcomes. The sanctum becomes another controlled environment, a territory whose rules he intends to internalize faster than anyone else. The world appears to confirm his approach. Threats are neutralized. Crises are contained. Reality bends in response to his intervention. Each success reinforces the same internal conclusion. Mastery works, yet something subtle shifts in the way power circulates around him. Strange does not simply respond to danger. He positions himself as the axis through which danger must pass. Decisions gravitate toward him. Authority consolidates without formal declaration. Others defer not because they are coerced, but because his certainty feels stabilizing. In moments of uncertainty, the one who appears least uncertain becomes the natural center. Strange understands this intuitively. He does not need to demand control. He attracts it. The manipulation of time marks a decisive escalation. When Strange reaches beyond spatial dominance into temporal rearrangement, the nature of his authority changes. Time is no longer a condition to endure, but a resource to exploit. Failure loses its finality. Consequence becomes provisional. The ability to repeat, rewind, and recalibrate introduces a dangerous asymmetry. Strange alone retains memory across iterations. Others remain trapped within linear causality. This creates an invisible hierarchy more absolute than any throne. The narrative frames this act as sacrifice, endless repetition, psychological endurance, willingness to suffer for the greater good. On the surface, this appears to be the erosion of ego through endurance. But structurally, something else occurs. Strange does not submit to time. He dominates it. He does not accept loss. He engineers its erasure. Pain is endured not as transformation, but as cost paid for control. The self remains intact. The world adapts around it. This is where spiritual ego reveals its core mechanism. It does not announce itself as arrogance. It presents as responsibility. Strange believes that because he can endure what others cannot, he must. This belief feels ethical. It sounds noble, but it also removes the possibility of shared burden. Suffering becomes justification for unilateral authority. Because he has paid the price, he alone decides the outcome. The center hardens. As threats escalate, Strange increasingly frames reality as something fragile that requires constant management. The universe appears as a structure perpetually on the brink of collapse, held together by vigilance and intervention. This worldview legitimizes expansion of control. Surveillance becomes protection. Secrecy becomes necessity. Isolation becomes duty. The more Strange intervenes, the more indispensable he appears. The more indispensable he becomes, the less accountable he feels. Others begin to sense the imbalance, though it remains difficult to articulate. The conflict is not about intent. Strange is not malicious. He does not seek domination for pleasure. The tension arises from posture. He stands above the system he claims to serve. Rules apply to others. Exceptions apply to him. This asymmetry is rarely challenged because the outcomes remain favorable. Victory masks distortion. Stability conceals cost. The mystical order itself mirrors this contradiction. It speaks the language of balance while relying on guardians who operate through control. It venerates detachment while rewarding decisive intervention. Strange thrives because he embodies this paradox perfectly. He is disciplined yet defiant, reverent yet transgressive. The institution absorbs his violations as evidence of his exceptionalism. Each boundary crossed becomes proof of necessity rather than warning. As Strange accumulates forbidden knowledge and unapproved methods, the system does not fracture immediately. It stretches. Limits bend to accommodate his will. The audience is invited to cheer ingenuity over obedience, innovation over restraint. Once again, mastery is rewarded. The deeper implication remains obscured. Power exercised without surrender reshapes the moral terrain around it. What was once unthinkable becomes pragmatic. What was once forbidden becomes justified. This phase concludes not with collapse, but with normalization. Strange's exceptional posture becomes standard operating procedure. The idea that someone must stand above the rules to protect them settles quietly into the narrative. The stage is set for polarization. The question is no longer whether Strange should intervene, but how far intervention can go before the structure it protects begins to erode from within. Polarization begins when intervention ceases to be reactive and becomes anticipatory. Strange no longer waits for threats to reveal themselves. He prepares for futures that have not yet occurred. Possibility itself becomes suspect. In a universe where outcomes can be foreseen and altered, uncertainty transforms from a condition of existence into a liability. Strange internalizes this shift without resistance. To him, foresight is not hubris but prudence. The more he sees, the more obligated he feels to act. This expansion of responsibility reshapes his moral landscape. Choice gives way to calculation. Risk is no longer shared across the collective, but absorbed into his own authority. Strange assumes the burden of deciding which realities are permissible and which must be prevented. The language surrounding these decisions emphasizes necessity. There is always a reason, a threat, a percentage, a future that must not be allowed to materialize. Ethics becomes actuarial. Meaning is compressed into probability. The fracture emerges most clearly in his relationship to others. Allies are no longer collaborators, but variables within a system he manages. Their autonomy becomes secondary to outcome optimization. Trust is replaced by containment. Information is withheld not out of malice, but efficiency. Strange believes that clarity belongs at the center, not the periphery. The more complex the threat, the narrower the circle of decision-making becomes. Inevitably, that circle collapses inward. This posture produces a subtle but decisive isolation. Strange does not withdraw emotionally. He withdraws structurally. Others remain present, but they no longer shape the direction of events. Their role is to execute, not to question. Dissent appears irresponsible in a world perpetually on the brink. The narrative reinforces this logic by validating strange predictions. Catastrophes occur. Sacrifices prove necessary. Each correct calculation deepens the justification for centralized authority. The manipulation of memory becomes a critical turning point. By altering what others can recall, Strange does not merely change outcomes. He reshapes the conditions under which moral judgment occurs. Actions cannot be evaluated if their causes are erased. Accountability dissolves when history becomes malleable. Strange understands this, but frames it as mercy. Pain spared, trauma avoided, stability preserved. The cost is invisible because it has been removed from perception. Here, spiritual ego reaches its most refined expression. It no longer needs recognition. It does not require admiration. It operates through inevitability. Strange does not ask others to trust him. He ensures they have no alternative. The system bends so thoroughly around his decisions that resistance appears irrational. What once felt like guardianship now resembles governance. The sanctum is no longer a refuge. It is a command center. Opposition arises not as villainy, but as reflection. Those who challenge Strange do so not from chaos, but from principle. They sense that something essential has been lost, even if outcomes remain favorable. The conflict sharpens because both sides claim protection as their aim. The difference lies in method. One insists on control as the price of survival. The other insists that survival without agency is already a form of collapse. Strange responds to resistance with restraint rather than confrontation. He listens. He acknowledges. Then he proceeds unchanged. This is not arrogance in the theatrical sense. It is certainty fortified by success. He believes the burden he carries absolves him of doubt. The more opposition he encounters, the more convinced he becomes that others cannot see the full picture. Perspective becomes privilege. Privilege becomes isolation. As the system polarizes, neutrality disappears. Characters must choose between alignment with Strange's expanding authority or resistance to its implications. The narrative no longer revolves around defeating external threats. It revolves around defining the shape of power itself. Is protection achieved through surrender of agency or through shared vulnerability? Is enlightenment the capacity to see all outcomes or the willingness to accept that some cannot be controlled? This phase ends not with resolution, but with crystallization. Strange stands firmly at the center of a structure that cannot function without him. The world is safer but narrower, more stable but less alive. The conflict has fully surfaced. What remains is consequence. Consequence arrives quietly, not as collapse but as compression. The world does not rebel against Strange's authority. It adapts to it. Systems reorganize themselves around his presence. Decisions accelerate because they no longer require debate. Crises resolve faster because dissent has been engineered out of the process. From a distance, this appears efficient. From within, something essential contracts. The space where uncertainty once lived has been sealed. Strange becomes increasingly defined by anticipation rather than experience. He no longer inhabits the present moment. He stands slightly ahead of it, scanning futures, weighing outcomes, preempting deviation. This temporal displacement creates a subtle estrangement. Others live inside events. Strange lives above them. The gap widens with every successful intervention. His clarity isolates him from the very reality he claims to protect. The psychological toll does not manifest as guilt or doubt. It appears as rigidity. Strange's imagination narrows even as his perception expands. He sees more but considers less. Alternatives that do not pass through his calculus feel irresponsible. The universe becomes legible only through his interpretive lens. This is not madness. It is coherence pushed beyond flexibility. The structure holds, but it no longer breathes. Relationships deteriorate not through conflict but through asymmetry. Strange remains calm, composed, assured. Others become reactive, frustrated, uncertain. The imbalance of knowledge poisons dialogue. One side argues from lived consequence, the other from abstract necessity. Communication fails because both operate on incompatible planes. Strange does not dismiss others as inferior. He simply outpaces them. Distance replaces disagreement. The symbolism of guardianship shifts. Protection no longer implies standing with the world. It implies standing above it. The protector becomes architect. The architect becomes warden. Walls rise not to keep enemies out, but to maintain order within. The sanctum transforms from threshold to fortress. Space itself reflects the contraction. Corridors narrow. Boundaries harden. Access becomes conditional. Strange's internal narrative frames these changes as burden. He carries what others cannot. He decides so they do not have to. This self-understanding insulates him from introspection. Sacrifice becomes identity. Endurance becomes proof of legitimacy. The longer he holds the line alone, the more impossible it becomes to imagine another configuration. Dependency solidifies on both sides. The world needs Strange. Strange needs the world to need him. This mutual entrapment marks the point of no return. The conflict can no longer be resolved through dialogue or recalibration. It has become structural. The question is no longer whether Strange is right. It is whether a system built around singular clarity can survive its own success. Stability achieved through compression accumulates pressure. Pressure seeks release. The narrative does not offer catharsis. There is no dramatic overthrow, no moral reckoning that restores balance. Instead, the consequence lingers as atmosphere. A world safer than before, yet strangely diminished. A guardian enlightened in language, but armored in posture. The spiritual has been absorbed into governance. Transcendence has been translated into management. What remains is a figure suspended between intention and effect. Strange did not seek domination. He sought order. He did not crave worship. He accepted necessity. Yet the path he walked reveals a recurring pattern. When insight is divorced from surrender, it hardens into authority. When enlightenment is measured by capacity rather than humility, it becomes indistinguishable from control. The stage clears. The system stands. The costs are not counted because they have no obvious victims. The consequence is diffuse, ambient, embedded in how the world now functions. The story moves forward carrying this weight, unresolved, irreversible, and quietly permanent. Dr. Strange does not function in the cultural imagination as a simple figure of mysticism or heroism. He operates as a mirror for a specific modern anxiety. The fear that chaos is always one mistake away. The belief that complexity requires management rather than participation. In this sense, Strange becomes less a character and more a symbolic technology. A narrative instrument designed to reassure audiences that someone, somewhere, sees the whole board. This reassurance carries weight because it speaks directly to contemporary conditions. Accelerated information flows, collapsing institutions, permanent crisis as background noise. In such an environment, the fantasy of a figure who can anticipate outcomes and neutralize risk before it manifests is deeply seductive. Strange embodies the promise that enlightenment can be operational, that wisdom can be applied like infrastructure, that uncertainty can be engineered away. The cultural appeal of this figure does not lie in mysticism itself, but in its domestication. The mystical world presented around Strange is not wild or destabilizing. It is bureaucratic, codified, governed by rules, artifacts, protocols. Ancient forces are rendered legible. Chaos is archived. Even infinity has filing systems. This framing reassures the audience that the unknown is not truly unknowable. It simply requires the right specialist. Within this symbolic economy, spiritual ego becomes not a flaw but a feature. The figure who believes he alone can bear the burden of knowledge aligns perfectly with cultures that reward overfunctioning and punish vulnerability. Strange does not ask the world to slow down. He adapts faster. He does not question the pace of catastrophe. He optimizes response. This posture resonates because it mirrors the internal strategies many adopt to survive systemic instability. The myth at work here is subtle. It suggests that transcendence does not require reorientation of values, but acquisition of superior perspective. That one can rise above conflict without being altered by it. That moral clarity emerges from distance rather than immersion. Strange calm detachment becomes aspirational, not because it is compassionate, but because it appears unbreakable. This is where the symbolic tension deepens. The narrative invites admiration for Strange's restraint while quietly normalizing the erosion of collective agency. Decisions are removed from shared space and relocated to elevated vantage points. The audience is trained to accept this because outcomes remain favorable. Disaster is averted. Order is preserved. The price is abstract. The beneficiaries are immediate. In this way, Dr. Strange participates in a broader cultural pattern. The elevation of figures who operate above process. The celebration of those who bypass consensus in the name of efficiency. The assumption that those who see more deserve to decide more. Spiritual language becomes the soft power that legitimizes this hierarchy. Enlightenment is invoked not to dissolve dominance, but to justify it. The symbolic architecture of the sanctum reinforces this dynamic. It sits at the center of urban space, yet remains inaccessible. A hidden fortress guarding reality. Knowledge is concentrated. Power is sequestered. Entry is conditional. This spatial metaphor mirrors the psychic arrangement Strange embodies. Insight elevated above lived experience. Protection separated from participation. Audiences rarely resist this framing, because it flatters a collective desire to be relieved of responsibility, to be protected without being implicated. Strange offers this fantasy without overt coercion. His authority feels earned. His sacrifices feel real. The system appears benign. This is precisely what makes the symbol effective. It does not impose control. It invites consent. Yet the unease lingers. The story repeatedly gestures toward discomfort without fully confronting it. Characters express concern. Friction surfaces. But the narrative structure ultimately reaffirms Strange's position. Dissent is acknowledged, then absorbed. The system remains intact. This containment mirrors how cultural systems often manage critique, by recognizing it without allowing it to transform the core. Dr. Strange thus becomes a contemporary myth about the limits of managed enlightenment. He represents the moment where spiritual aspiration intersects with administrative logic, where transcendence is translated into governance, where the language of higher awareness masks a deeper attachment to centrality. The cultural impact of this figure lies not in what he defeats, but in what he normalizes. The idea that safety requires surveillance, that wisdom justifies exemption, that clarity belongs at the center. These ideas persist beyond the narrative. They echo in institutions, technologies, and leadership models that privilege oversight over participation. The symbol endures because it remains unresolved. Strange is not framed as tyrant nor as liberator. He occupies the liminal space between necessity and excess. This ambiguity allows the figure to adapt across contexts, to be read as protector in one era and warning in another. The myth remains active because it reflects a conflict the culture itself has not settled. What Dr. Strange ultimately offers is not a vision of enlightenment achieved, but a portrait of enlightenment instrumentalized. A reminder that insight, when severed from surrender, does not dissolve power. It reorganizes it. The question the symbol leaves hanging is not whether Strange is right, but whether a culture that needs him can imagine another way to be safe. The legacy of Dr. Strange does not reside in the spells he casts or the catastrophes he prevents. It settles elsewhere, in the architecture of authority he leaves behind. The world he helps stabilize does not return to its prior openness. It reorganizes itself around the assumption that stability requires oversight, that vigilance must be continuous, that someone must remain awake so others can sleep. This assumption outlives any single crisis. It becomes ambient truth. Strange's final position is not one of triumph, but of fixation. He is locked into function. The protector cannot step away without risking collapse, not because the world is inherently fragile, but because it has been conditioned to rely on his presence. The burden he carries has transformed into structure. What once felt like sacrifice now feels like obligation. The role persists even when the urgency fades. Psychologically, this crystallization reveals the ultimate cost of spiritual ego. Strange does not experience corruption as decay. He experiences it as permanence. The self that once sought restoration has become inseparable from the system it maintains. Identity and function collapse into one another. There is no longer a clear distinction between who he is and what he must do. This fusion forecloses transformation. Growth would require relinquishment, and relinquishment would dismantle the order he sustains. The myth does not punish him for this. There is no narrative retribution. Instead, it grants him relevance. Strange remains indispensable, consulted at the margins of every threat, invoked as final authority. This endurance is framed as honor, yet it functions as containment. He is preserved not as a man, but as an instrument. Enlightenment, once invoked as promise, hardens into role. Culturally, this aftermath resonates because it mirrors a familiar pattern. Systems that elevate individuals to manage complexity rarely imagine succession. The exceptional becomes irreplaceable. The temporary solution becomes permanent infrastructure. What begins as response to crisis becomes justification for ongoing concentration of power. Strange embodies this arc without spectacle. His stillness is the warning. The absence of closure is intentional. The story does not resolve the tension between insight and surrender. It allows it to sediment. Dr. Strange remains suspended in a posture that feels necessary and yet incomplete. The myth does not ask whether he could have chosen differently. It asks whether the conditions that produced him would allow a different outcome at all. What lingers is not condemnation but clarity. The recognition that enlightenment framed as capacity, rather than humility, inevitably reproduces hierarchy. That spiritual language, when severed from relinquishment, becomes an elegant shield for control. Strange's legacy is not the mastery of hidden dimensions, but the exposure of a paradox the culture continues to inhabit. The figure endures because he is believable, because he reflects a world that prizes foresight over presence, management over participation, safety over transformation. Dr. Strange stands as a modern guardian whose power feels justified and whose posture remains unresolved. His myth does not close a chapter. It leaves a structure standing, quietly asking how long it can hold without becoming the very threat it was built to prevent.